Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General from Total War Warhammer News. Now, this is for Total War Warhammer, the first game, guys. We have had an update on what the old friend is. Now, that doesn't mean a reveal, but we've had an update. So let's have a look at that, shall we? So, the new content team, the old friend will indeed be our next content drop for Warhammer. It's tied to an event later in the summer. I know there's some excitement, but it's just a small thing that we wanted to do. Think along the lines of the Blood Knight free LC rather than Lords or anything. Not saying it's a unit specifically, but it's that sort of scale addition to the game. The event gave us a chance to do something, so we took it. Having said that, I can say it won't be the last addition to Warhammer. As mentioned in the previous blog a few months ago, we'd been thinking about what sort of content could be added to the first game and what that might be. We've hit on something we think is a pretty good opportunity to add some more content to the game. So there will be a new race pack released later this year before Warhammer 2 is released. That's good news. No, it's not Kislev. That's bad news. But the new content team have got some rather unique gameplay mechanics for this new race, and it will come with a small update to the main game and a free LC drop. This particular free LC will benefit not only main game owners, but also DLC owners too this time. Interesting. Otherwise, the new content team are in early concept and design stages for the first Warhammer 2 DLC Outpost launch. So we have a good idea of what that will be, most likely Tomb Kings if it's not a pre-order bonus. So what exactly does this all mean? It's still all a little bit cryptic, but let's go through it. So we're getting the old friend. Now the old friend looks like it's not going to be a lord. So that actually changes a lot of the way we have to look at the old friend. It ties into the Patreon Q&A I did recently for my patrons. But what I was saying was, the longer this goes on, the wait for the old friend, the less likely it looked like it was going to be Boris. But let's try and figure out what they're talking about. So an event later on this summer. So is it going to be themed around that event? What could that event possibly be? So this is just me after, what, half an hour of Googling or something like that. I tried to do some logic and look up what was coming up event-wise. Now, I figured this wasn't a Creative Assembly computer event, and it's not like an anniversary of Creative Assemblies, because that doesn't necessarily tie in, which leaves us with Warhammer-based events. Now, Games Workshop do a thing called Warhammer Fest, I think it is. That happened towards the back end of May. So it's not that. It's not for that event. So I sort of took to Google a little bit to see what sort of old Warhammer stuff might be coming up for anniversaries. Now, from this point on in the video, guys, this is pure speculation on my behalf. As I said, about half an hour of looking stuff up on the internet. Some sleuths on the blogs will figure this out before I eventually figure it out. But here's what I've come up with so far in terms of what that event could possibly be. A couple of options for us. And I figure it has to do with the old Warhammer Fantasy. Now, Games Workshop, the creators of Warhammer Fantasy, have for the most part washed their hands with it. There's not really a lot more going on. But there are a couple of things coming up that are possibilities. Now, the first thing I want to have a quick look at is the idea of the races before we go into the event possibilities, guys. Now, if it's not Kislev, Kislev is the, apart from Skaven. Now, there's no way, I don't think, that they add Skaven, they sell you Skaven before Total War Warhammer 2 comes out, so I just wrote that option off. Now, that would be a very bold and strange move, because it really takes away from the value price of Total War Warhammer 2 if you can just download Skaven as a paid-for race in Total War Warhammer 1 and have that carry over to the combined map. So we'll have to wait and see. That would be a very weird thing to do unless they split Skaven into some of their, along there, maybe their clan divides to a certain extent, and they take Clan Pestilence, which is the clan that has most to do in the Warhammer world with the Southlands and the New World, really in Lustria. They have a lot of history in that area, and they separate them out into a completely different Skaven faction. And they give us Clan Pestilence in Total War Warhammer 2 and just keep the rest of Skavendom for the main Old World map. That would be drastic. That would be severely drastic, and I just don't think that's what it's going to be. But an outsider possibility. Now, the other obvious candidates, if we're not looking at Kislev, which are the only real guys with an army book, in terms of a separate race, which I'm not necessarily discluding from a broken off faction. So here are the two options I came up with. It's either the Halflings, which would be amazing, and Halflings live in the Moot, for those of you who don't know. If you guys want some lore on the Halflings in the Warhammer world, do check the top right hand corner now for my video on the Moot and the Halfling society in the Moot. So they would end up right next to the vampire counts and make a very interesting new play experience. But it would be quite difficult, not impossible, however, to stretch them out to being a full race. Now, the most likely possibility is that what they've done is the old friend was maybe going to be Boris thrown on at the end, but due to the popularity of Warhammer, they were like, okay, let's hold on to that concept, and let's actually expand out Middenland as an entire faction and make that the race pack. So we'll get the Knights Panther, we'll get the Knights of the White Wolf, we'll get the Ulrich Warrior Priest. That would be amazing, and there's more than enough material to make a Middenland race pack. The issue with that is I'm not sure what new mechanics they'd be talking about. They mentioned there'd be new mechanics for this race. Off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure what those would be that hugely differ from the Empire general mechanics as they play today. You could chuck a few particularly superfluous things in there just to get them to play slightly differently, but there's no necessarily like massive mechanics overhaul that I can envisage for a Midland faction. Now, the Halflings might need a completely different mechanic system to survive, being on the border between the Empire and the Vampire counts and some gobbos coming up through Blackfire Pass. That I can imagine them making up more mechanics for. But for me, here we go. Front runner, Middenland. Second is the idea of the Halflings. And third for the new race, I would say, is probably the concept of Skaven being introduced before Warhammer 2. Other than that, I find it a little bit tricky to think of what they'd make an entirely new race out of off the top of my head, guys. So that's my thinking on that. So that's what I'm thinking for the new race. Now, the events we spoke about. What event could they possibly be trying to tie this into as far as the Old Friend free DLC is concerned? Well, the one thing I was able to pull out is the first issue of White Dwarf, Games Workshop magazine, came out roughly 40 years ago this month or last month. It came out in June, July. It was a bi-monthly magazine then. So you could say they could stretch that anniversary over in White Dwarf until sort of July, August time when they released the magazine then, and then you could get, 40th anniversary issue, here's a unit, much like they did for Grombrindal, here's a unit to celebrate 40 years of White Dwarf magazine. That could be an event they talk about. And it might just be my imagination, but these particular little fellas down here could pass as halflings, or more accurately then probably, halflings or hobbits. Because I believe in 1977, Warhammer the game didn't actually exist. And Games Workshop, I think, was just a shop in the UK that sold D&D stuff. And they just made a magazine to promote D&D stuff rather than any of their own games, which, as I say, didn't exist at the time. But it would be a 40th anniversary of White Dwarf. Now, another option we could be looking at is an announcement that came towards the back end of last month, I think, that fantasy roleplay is being resurrected, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, for a 4th edition. Now, I think that was last month, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember that off the top of my head correctly. Now, that's another area that might be entering into the now deceased Warhammer Fantasy Battle universe rather than the Age of Sigmar stuff. But I'm not sure if these guys because Games Workshop are effectively outsourcing this to another company called Crucible 7, something along those lines. That's not exactly right. And so it might be a celebration, and roleplay itself is about 30 years old itself. About 31, really. I've seen countering dates on that. Some have said it was released in 87, others said it was released in 86. So they could be waiting for a chance to promote 4th edition fantasy roleplay, both again in White Dwarf. Maybe promote the new fantasy roleplay version, promote the 40th edition of White Dwarf, and then Games Workshop have made a little gift for everyone in the magazine just to celebrate that. Now, again, these are things that just came off the top of my head as far as ideas, guys. Now, if you're wanting to go back and maybe toy around with the idea of stuff that are iconic units for Warhammer, and maybe something that would just be a bit of fun to make, and something, if you remember from the description before, described as a little bit small, which is the exact terminology I think Grace used in a Reddit thread or a blog thread earlier, a couple of months ago, to describe this DLC as well. She used the phrase, "it's a small thing." Now, they do like their punditry in Creative Assembly, so I think they might be hinting at a possible halfling unit. Now, that would be amazing, and for me, and for many other Warhammer fans, I think the most iconic halfling unit that would make an amazing little artillery piece for the Empire is the halfling hot pot. Now, if they added this as the old friend, it is an old friend to any Warhammer fan. It's been an iconic unit for them for ages, and it would also go towards just being included in a number of different armies. Now, where this gets tricky is where they refer to in the statement as you'll get free DLC that can be applicable to even downloadable races. That's where they lose me a bit. I'm not sure what they mean, and I'm not sure if they mean the old friend is applicable to those, unless they just made the Halfling Hotpot a mercenary unit that anyone could recruit, which would be slight madness, really, but they could go down that line. Lore-wise, it wouldn't make much of any sense. But for me, that's the most iconic Halfling unit. If you're not doing the full Halfling race, and you're looking for a bit of a throwback to celebrate Warhammer Fantasy, or to celebrate the 40th year of Warhammer of White Dwarf, this could be the unit that does it. But this is, again, just off the top of my head. As I say, guys, pure speculation, and only my own. I haven't had much of a time to dig into the forums or anything to see what other people are saying. But that's what I'm thinking for them. And as I said, guys, I think the front runner for the race that we'd have to pay for now, which would make sense because there is a lot they can add to it, is Middenland. So I think those two combined, to see what kind of units, if you guys haven't seen it already, one might be able to expect of the Middenland race pack, do check the top right hand corner or the description below now for my Middenland lore video. That has a lot of kind of the stuff I broke down that could be added to any kind of Middenland army. But that's what I'm thinking, guys. Celebrate an anniversary of some sort for Games Workshop. Get out something small, which is weird that they've used the exact same terminology twice and two different people when they've been writing it as well. That just struck me as a little bit odd. So it would be amazing to see the Halflings as a race. I just can't. It's just hard to stretch out a full army book for them, I think. But Midland, I think a lot of people have been clamoring for, and it would also just steal up that issue of 2 starting positions for every race in Total War Warhammer, except for the Empire. So this would now give the Empire 2 different starting positions. And technically, yes, Midland, not the Empire, not the same thing, true. But it kind of ticked that box for people who like to play as humans. So there we go, guys. That's my thinking on it. There was also some exciting news historically in terms of a couple of new historical titles on the way now, not just the one announced, and some new DLC for historical titles. I might make another video on that. Do let me know in the comments if you're interested in seeing me address that issue. But I thought I'd address the old friend first, as we've been a channel so far predominantly focused on Total War Warhammer. But there we go, guys. That's just my 2 cents on it. Probably 90% wrong, but there you go. Those are my thoughts. All right, guys. As always, huge thank you for watching. Special thanks to my patrons, John, Reese, Colin, Thomas, Mateus, Samuel, Matthews, Peter, and David. And again, hope to catch you all on the next video, guys. And thanks again for watching.